So my name's Una, so I'm a member of Stop the War on Palestine, and I'll be chairing tonight's meeting on the future of Palestine and the one-state solution. So we have three guest speakers tonight. So first speaking, we'll have Nikolai. So Nikolai is a Lebanese-Australian author, activist, and secretary of Arab Theatre Studio, who will be speaking on both about Israel's attacks on Lebanon as well as the future for Palestine and the one-state solution. We'll also be hearing from Randa Abdel-Fattah. So Randa is an Australian-born writer, human rights activist, and academic of Palestinian and Egyptian background. She's a multi-award-winning author of 11 novels as well as a non-fiction works such as Coming of Age in the War on Terror. She's made numerous media appearances, including on ABC's Q&A, SBS's Insight program, and Channel 7's Sunrise, advocating for Palestine. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from another Stop the War on Palestine member, Caitlin. And yeah, Caitlin's just going to speak about a bit more of the activism stuff, and yeah, maybe connecting the dots of what Nikolai and Randa talk about, and then maybe how we can, I guess, a bit of direction on where we're going to go with activism, perhaps. And then once we've all heard from our speakers, everyone will get a chance to discuss. So basically, yeah, at the end, it's discussion time. You can ask questions, or if you just have anything in general you'd like to say. So yeah, I'll talk more about how that will work after we finish speaking. So yeah, Nikolai, if you want to get going.
Thanks a lot. I would first like to start by expressing my absolute solidarity with the struggle of Aboriginal people for liberation on this continent and land back. I'll be talking a bit mostly about Lebanon, and I will leave the future of Palestine and the one-state solution to Randa, but I will be just talking about some broader stuff that may relate to that as well. The situation, as we all know, in Lebanon has become increasingly dire over the past few weeks. Israel has carried out intense airstrikes all over the country in an attempted ground invasion. The remote control explosion of hundreds of pages and electronic devices in civilian areas, used mainly by non-combatants, killing and wounding thousands of people. It has dropped multiple US-supplied 900-kilo bunker buster bombs on Beirut, razing numerous apartment buildings to the ground and demolishing entire neighborhoods. Including today, there was a huge strike. It has deliberately targeted hospitals and civilian infrastructure, including just yesterday the Al-Muqtada hospital in Baalbek. Israel has shelled southern Lebanon with banned cluster bombs and used depleted uranium munitions in Beirut. Up to 1.2 million Lebanese have been forcibly displaced from their homes, and in this short time, 1,500 have been killed and more than 10,000 injured. Israel has deliberately targeted journalists, firefighters, first responders, and UN peacekeepers, including, we found out, with chemical weapons. So it's clear that Israel is applying the same logic in Lebanon that it is applying in Palestine. And I use the word logic deliberately. Over the past couple of days, we have seen things in Gaza we will never be able to unsee. Children hunted down and killed by a drone quadcopter as they were trying to flee. Children blown up while playing with marbles. Strikes on refugee tents in a hospital yard. Men, women and children burned alive. A man incinerated while holding an IV drip. The sheer scale and cruelty of this violence may lead some to believe that Israel is a mad beast acting without control or purpose and drunk with impunity. But nothing could be further from the truth. There's a very clear objective to this violence, and the cruelty is the point. It is the implementation of the expansionary and eliminatory logic of this brand of settler colonialism, the aim of which is to kill, subjugate, and ethnically cleanse as many natives from the land as possible in order for the colonists to take over. One of the specific strategies deployed in pursuit of this goal is to impose colonial terror on an industrial scale against civilian populations in order to crush resistance to this project. Israel had a name for this strategy, which it coined during its 2006 war on Lebanon, the Dahiya Doctrine, named after the vibrant suburb in Beirut South that is now unrecognizable as a result of Israel's relentless strikes. The Dahiya Doctrine refers to a strategy to deploy massive, disproportionate force and the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure with the intention of achieving what is termed a sustained deterrent impact. After the genocide in Gaza, some commentators have said that Israel's Dahiya doctrine has evolved into the Gaza doctrine. Dr. Amal Saad, a lecturer in politics and international relations at Cardiff University, wrote, Israel's actions in Lebanon do not embody the Dahiya doctrine, but rather the Gaza doctrine, as starkly demonstrated by Netanyahu's ultimatum to free Lebanon from Hezbollah or face destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. The key distinction between the two doctrines lies in the Gaza doctrine's genocidal and ethnic cleansing aims, which are now beginning to manifest in Lebanon. And it is important to remember that Lebanon, like Palestine, is a country without an air force and with no effective air defense systems. But despite this, in the south of Lebanon, Israel's attempted ground invasion is being fiercely resisted. And it is also important to note that Hezbollah started its involvement in the war under the rubric of what it termed as a solidarity front. From the very first day of this latest iteration of the 100-year colonial war on Palestine, Israel bombed residential apartment buildings in Gaza. Hezbollah's first military actions on the 8th of October last year targeted Israeli military infrastructure on Lebanese territory in the occupied Shabaa farms. It has been Israel that has escalated the war on the Lebanese front to civilian and military targets throughout larger parts of southern Lebanon and now the entire country. The real strategic objectives of Israel's actions were clear from the very beginning of the genocide and are now undeniable. As far back as 13th of October, Israel's intelligence ministry published a proposal to transfer the entire population of Gaza to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Settler organisations and parliamentarians have openly declared their intention to establish colonies in Gaza. Israel has seized or declared its intention to seize vast swathes of land in the West Bank, including the land which previously housed the United Nations Relief Works Agency office in East Jerusalem. And last week, Israeli media reported a plan for retired Israeli generals to the Israeli government that articulated the policy of siege, starvation, and industrial slaughter in North Gaza in order to ethnically cleanse and annex such lands to pave the way for Jewish settlements. The same objectives apply to Lebanon. Israel has invaded Lebanon at least 4 times and occupied southern Lebanon up to the Litani River for 18 years, from 1982 until they were driven out in 2000 by the Lebanese resistance. Even before the State of Israel was established, early Zionists tried to convince the colonial powers to make the Litani River the border between Lebanon and Palestine. On the 25th of September, the Jerusalem Post, a mainstream Israeli paper, published an article that claimed Lebanon was part of Israel's promised land. On the 11th of October, Bezalel Smotrich claimed that Israel would expand little by little and eventually encompass all of Palestine, as well as parts of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. This may seem like the unhinged fantasies of a far-right lunatic, but it is important to note that Smotrich is not some fringe outlier member of the Knesset, but the finance minister of Israel. The very same Israel whose citizens have elected Netanyahu as prime minister no less than 6 times since 1996. The stakes could not be higher. The civilian population of South Lebanon has been largely displaced, and if the resistance is unable to repel the invaders and the world is unable to stop this war, Israel may yet be able to achieve its goals in Palestine and Lebanon. There's no way that Israel would ever have even existed, let alone expanded, without the full backing of imperialism. It is a barely mentioned historical fact that the first Zionist colonists that came to Palestine from Europe in the late 19th century were granted economic privileges and consular protections as Europeans under the capitulations, a series of unequal treaties between the declining Ottoman Empire and Western powers. After World War I, Britain and France divided the lands of Southwest Asia between them, pursuant to the Sykes-Picot Treaty. France got Lebanon and Syria, Britain took Iraq, Palestine and Jordan. The Western-dominated League of Nations provide an ideological cover for this naked imperialism by calling it a mandate. Historically, our lands have been, and peoples have been interconnected. Much of what is now southern Lebanon was the hinterland of Palestine's coastal cities. People in Tripoli in North Lebanon moved and mingled without borders with people from Tartus in what is now Syria. The towns and villages and cities of the region were interconnected through networks of trade, culture, and kinship. After World War I, the British handed Palestine to the Zionists on a platter by facilitating and supporting massively expanded Zionist colonization, nursing the infrastructure of the nascent state, and brutally suppressing the Palestinian national liberation movement. And the US, Germany, and Europe have armed and backed Israel consistently from then to this very day. The US alone has given $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel this year since the start of the genocide. And last week, it openly deployed 100 soldiers to operate a highly advanced missile system in Israel. After France gained control of Syria under the so-called mandate, it too brutally suppressed a national liberation movement that consisted of a pluralistic alliance of people from various tribes and faiths. The French Empire then implemented the classic colonial strategy of divide and rule. It carved Lebanon out of Syria and promoted minority communities to rule in both countries in an attempt to create a local elite with power and privilege that would remain dependent on and loyal to the empire, thereby establishing the foundations for weak neo-colonial states dominated by autocracy, corruption, and riven with sectarianism. Lebanon, although formally democratic and with a relatively free press, remains dominated by powerful elites backed by outside powers. The Lebanese constitution was adopted in 1926 during French imperialist rule and instituted a confessional system that allocated political representation and power based on religious affiliation. Under this confessional system, the president of Lebanon must be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament a Shia Muslim. 50% of seats in parliament are reserved for Christians, 50% for Muslims. But this split does not reflect the contemporary demography of Lebanon, and the last official census was carried out in 1932. Additionally, jobs in state institutions are allocated on the basis of religious affiliation, meaning that powerful families gain influence in their respective communities by distributing patronage, access to services and jobs in a system of institutionalized nepotism. But local corruption is just a factor or a symptom of the far greater problem, which is sectarianism, which Lebanese Marxist revolutionary Mahdi Amel writes. Sectarianism is a particular historical form of the political system through which the colonial bourgeoisie exercises its class dominance within a relation of structural dependency on imperialism. And the US Embassy in Beirut is a fitting metaphor for such influence. Lebanon is a small country of 6 million people with a collapsed economy, few resources, and no regional or global influence. Yet the United States has recently constructed a fortified embassy on a 43-acre site in Beirut, the second largest in the world after the American embassy in Baghdad, which is more like a military base than a diplomatic mission. It would take another entire talk to talk about and analyse Hezbollah's role in the system and Iranian influence in the country and the region, which, while significant, is of a completely different magnitude and political economic structure to that of Western imperialism. Israel, the US, and their allies have long tried to exploit Lebanon's sectarian system to advance their goals in the region. This was abundantly clear from Netanyahu's video address to the Lebanese people last week, in which he explicitly called for civil war to remove Hezbollah. It was also clear on Tuesday when Israeli warplanes bombed the Christian Maronite village of Aitu in North Lebanon, very close to my hometown of Farsrab. 21 internally displaced people from South Lebanon were killed in this massacre. The aim of the strike was clear. It was a deliberate escalation of colonial terror on civilians pursuant to the Dahia Doctrine or the Gaza Doctrine to punish Lebanese civilians wherever they were sheltering for the military operations carried out by the resistance. But it was also aimed at stoking sectarian tension and civil strife by turning Lebanese against each other in order to create a right-wing Maronite-dominated state that would ally with Israel and imperialism. But Israel's objectives in promoting a civil war in Lebanon will not be realised. Despite Lebanon's divisions and sectarian system, most political parties in the country have at least formally put disputes on hold during this war, even those from the parliamentary bloc opposed to Hezbollah. I'm sure the leaders of such parties are acting out of self-preservation and reflecting popular sentiment. And of course, there are some commentators and parties that have tried to exploit this moment, but they remain militarily and ideologically weak. Karim Makdisi, a professor from the American University of Beirut, recently described this phenomenon, and I quote, "The Zionist model of apartheid and ethnic purity and exclusiveness is existentially threatened by coexistence amongst people of various faiths and ethnicity, the Lebanon model for all its many ills. Zionism requires both ethnic cleansing in areas it wants to colonize, Palestine and South Lebanon, and formal states based on ethnic, religious exclusiveness, not coexistence, to justify a Jewish state with the attendant goal to cleanse 1948 lands of all non-Jews. Resistance to Zionism requires not just that South Lebanon not fall to the invaders, but that we insist on our history, culture, and politics of coexistence." And that's what we are working towards today. This is the future that we are trying to create, where Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria can return to their homes and lands in Palestine, should they choose to do so, and those who wish to remain enjoy full social, political, and economic rights in their adopted country. We're working towards where there's no racial, religious, or class supremacy, and the borders that divide us are broken down, along with the system of imperialism that maintains them. Where we can create a new age of plurality, built on a deep foundation of social and economic justice, not just for Palestine and Lebanon, but for the whole world.
Thanks so much, Nikolai. That was really informative. Next we'll hear from Randa about the future of Palestine and the one-state solution. And I forgot to mention, sorry, before the speakers, you'll speak for 20 minutes? Yeah. I'll give you a tap of 5, we have 5 minutes left.
Sure.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Nikolai,
you.
that was tremendous. Can you all hear me?
Not very well.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't think so.
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today and pay my sincere respects to the sovereign owners of this land, the Gadigal people. For racialised immigrants and refugees who form the diaspora of empire, Asl is everything. Our roots, our origins. Who is your father, your grandfather? What village originally? I am the daughter of a Palestinian man who is older than the illegitimate state of Israel. I'm the daughter of an Egyptian mother whose family's life trajectory in Egypt was impacted by colonialism, forcing them to migrate to this colony. So we, the diaspora of empire, live on indigenous land as beneficiaries of settlement, whilst traversing subject positions as victims of imperialism, the global military-industrial complex, and racial capitalism. The work we do is to borrow from Robin Kelly, rooted in an analytic of world-making. That is a shared vision of mutual liberation based on the indivisibility of justice. And so I return always to Asl, not just mine, but the unceded lands of the Darug people on whose land I live, write, fight, protest, and raise my children on and from. How do we begin to even imagine the future? It's been 376 days of white supremacy in its most naked, brute, and calculated state. As I see people, children, burning alive on my screen, between ads for makeup and wretched emails from my university, I find it impossible to mark this moment of passing a year of history's first live-stream genocide the way I am expected to curate facts and figures that encapsulate the apocalyptic horror we have witnessed for the past year, and to stocktake our suffering as the genocide continues and Israel's industrialized slaughter expands to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and a confrontation with Iran. How do we pivot from the present-day massacres to thinking about the future and about coexistence? I will try to get us there, but I want to do so by first acknowledging that so much of the public discourse on one state and two state is always predicated on Palestinians standing accused. We say freedom and they say anti-Semitism. We say from the river to the sea, everyone will be equal and free, and they say genocide, destruction, elimination. We say decolonization, they say racism. We refuse this onus. When the Zionist project has, from its beginning, been predicated on our destruction, our erasure, it is not on us to prove our moral credentials. So I want to think through how we reckon with imagining the future at this time. At this sheer and incomprehensibly depraved time, I won't even need to rewind 1 year. For the past week, we have seen live streamed on our screens scenes of savage barbaric violence, methodically inflicted on a besieged refugee population as the world watches on, in the service of a political project that has unfinished demographic business, that requires the extermination of the brutes, the elimination of the native, in order to achieve the goal of a Jewish majority and control over the entire stolen land from the river to the sea and beyond into southern Lebanon and Syria. As Sami Hermes so eloquently puts it, these are called crimes against humanity because they are crimes against us all, but they happen to be enacted on the bodies of Palestinians, on the bodies of Lebanese, on the bodies of Arabs. And so we come to the realization that we are, as Lana Totur puts it, excluded from the category of human. We are not human, and therefore these crimes against humanity do not matter. We, on the other hand, are not considered human, and therefore these are not considered crimes. To drop 2,000-pound bombs on refugee tents and a hospital and burn alive patients as they are hooked up to an IV drip is not a crime. It is self-defense. It is a US-funded countering anti-Semitism rehab program. It is a human bonfire at the recreational camp of Western civilization. The Western world, including this settler colony, not only refuses to stop this extermination campaign, but continues to actively support and sponsor it. And this is because the glue between Australia and Israel, between Western governments and Israel, is white supremacy and imperialism. Israel is able to do this because it has been granted cover and impunity for 100 years. In the words of human rights lawyer Craig Mukhibir, Israel has just now moved from a strategy of incremental genocide to expedited genocide. How do you carry out expedited genocide in the 21st century? How do you target and slaughter men, women, and children and gleefully broadcast your crimes in TikTok videos? How do you conduct a savage war on people's right to food, environmental health, sustainability, home, safe shelter, infrastructure, roads, education, reproductive rights, and on and on? You have to establish Gaza as a mass indiscriminate killing field. You have to reach into the colonial playbook, which demarcated the civilized center with the native reservations, where colonizers could freely murder, rape, brutalize, and enslave, whilst maintaining that they were civilized. Flatten Gaza, as Israeli officials have cheered on, means flatten the distinctions between human beings, man, woman, child, baby, disabled, exit an IVF clinic. Flatten the distinction between human and non-human. Shield your actions with categories like civilian and terrorist. Flatten moral and legal distinctions so that an entire place becomes a justified killing field. Earlier this year, Special UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese issued a report on the de-civilianization of Palestinians, whereby Israel has designated the whole population as a killable target. Israel has tried to make Gaza a world without civilians, To take shelter in a hospital, a school, a refugee camp is deemed human shielding, making everyone a killable target. And now we see this egregious argument applied to Lebanon and the revolting way it was defended with the pagers and walkie-talkie attacks. All Israel had to say was that it was targeting pagers owned by Hezbollah, and everyone, children, doctors, nurses, people shopping for groceries, were suddenly justifiable, killable targets. This is where accountability is key, and our archives of accountability will be ready for the moment of our reckoning against the political class, media, academics, and all who were complicit actively or who were via their revolting silence. Do we all remember 31st of October 2023? Israeli bombers dropped a carefully calibrated batch of 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of the Jabalia refugee camp, destroying the entire city block in a single moment and wounding and killing hundreds of civilians. Israel said the intended target was one particular Hamas official, whose presence was not even confirmed, and that all those hundreds of people just happened to be in the way. Israeli officials' justification was that they consider any man, woman, or child among the estimated 300,000 people who remained in northern Gaza to be a terrorist accomplice and therefore a candidate for killing. It was not condemned, it was not sanctioned. So Israel, the following day, did the same thing to Buruj refugee camp, and the day after, Maghazi refugee camp, and the day after that, and on it goes. And now we see that what is heinous today is banal tomorrow as Israel's frenzy of savagery intensifies. The massacres and horror are in their rerun era. An Israeli airstrike killed 4 boys playing soccer by the beach in Gaza in July 2014. 3 days ago, an Israeli airstrike killed children playing with marbles in Al-Shati refugee camp. And we can measure the distance between both atrocities in the billions of dollars in arms sent to Israel. We can measure the distance between burying the remains of the soccer-playing boys in 2014 and burying the remains of the marble-playing boys this week via a word count of how many times Western leaders have bleated right to resist, right to self-defense, or how many headlines were published defending Israel and demonizing Palestinian resistance. There is a chain of causation, a pipeline of enablement between every atrocity, and that pipeline and each clink in the chain starts here in the West. People ask Palestinians, what can we do? It's not stopping, they're still slaughtering, it's getting worse. The necessary condition for the flow of arms and capital is at best that the masses in these donor supply states remain silent or vaguely sympathetic but passive in acquiescence to what they consider to be too complex or too hard or beyond their power, or at worst actively complicit. You need to position yourself in both or either camps. For the first group, educate, shame, or expose the ones who need reminding that there are no both sides to genocide. There are no both sides to burning kids, that silence is consent. And if basic human empathy does not work, then invoke good old-fashioned selfish self-interest and remind them of the boomerang effect of colonization, in the words of Amy Cesare in his powerful book, Discourse on Colonialism. What is tested on Palestinians, what is tested on Lebanese, what is tested on Arabs will come back and be used against you. Or position yourself in the second group and hold power to account, expose, archive, collect your receipts, gather your evidence and exhibits, because one thing we know is that empire is crumbling. And this brings me to the explicit topic of today's event, the future of Palestine and the one-state solution. I started writing my talk through a legal analysis, a historical and sociological lens, but then I stopped, because whilst all of that matters and might be something we discuss in Q&A, I really think we need to address some fundamental existential questions here that go to the heart of what it is we are imagining and who belongs with us in our liberation journey and our liberated land. So the first thing I want to say is this, and as I say this, I am directing this to every Palestinian here today, any Lebanese, any Syrian, Yemenis, any Arab whose lives and histories have been impacted by this Zionist colony. You are magnificent, you are beautiful. For over 100 years, you have enacted a politics and ethics of living, though you are constantly condemned to death. You have embodied defiance and resistance, sumud, and an unwavering insistence on your humanity, on your right to lives of intrinsic dignity, imagination, vision, laughter, and love. The future of Palestine, of an Arab world free of this Zionist state, is already here now. It is in the herb garden Palestinians plant among the rubble that will take over 16 years to clear. It is in the inventions they make to keep children entertained through the noise of drones. It is in the schools that run in bombed tents. It is in the homes and villages in North Lebanon, sheltering the displaced across sectarian divides, even though this places a target on them. It is your dignity, compassion, and strength as you navigate a violent, dehumanizing society that mocks and erases your suffering, that privileges the feelings of genocide supporters in your workplaces. It is the insistence on your humanity that drives the Zionist entity mad with envy and rage. The second thing flows from this, from knowing who we are, what we deserve, and are owed. The March 2024 Palestinian Unity Manifesto declared, "We have entered the century of our liberation, and the occupying power is weaker than ever before." I do not doubt that justice will eventually prevail. Israel and the Western world and Arab regimes will collapse under the weight of their own crimes. As Nora Erakat says, genocide is suicide. They will be held to account by the people, and there will be a time for reckoning. Thus, when we are charged with accusations that we want to destroy Israel, there is much we have to say in response. First, Israel is destroying itself. I recently listened to an interview with lawyer Diana Batu on the Jadaliya website. And she was saying that around the world we see that younger generations are leaning more to the left, becoming more progressive, more socially aware. But in Israel, the younger generation are moving more extreme. They're at the front lines of and celebrating genocide. That is a society that will rot from within. Second, the goal is decolonization, dismantling the Zionist state. It has and never had a right to exist. It is a violent squatter on our land. It is a stain on humanity. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, theft, massacres were an existential necessity for its establishment, and they are a necessary condition for it to continue to exist. And in no moral universe is this sustainable unless you are willing to accept the elimination of the Palestinian people. 100 years of subjugation, murderous campaigns, apartheid and colonization, and Palestinians are still here stronger and more defiant than ever. And though there are many who seek our elimination, we refuse, we refuse, we refuse. I again invoke the words of the 2021 and 2024 Unity Intifada and affirm that Palestinians are one people, that we belong to the whole of Palestine and it belongs to us, and there will never be Palestinian sovereignty without dismantling Zionism. The future of Palestine is decolonization. It is dismantling and undoing the Zionist political project. We will not coexist with Zionism. And this is not just polemics. Actually, it is my legal training that makes me always think about the rebuttal. I always weigh the merits of the opposing argument. Does Zionism have the capacity to coexist with us? It is a nonsense proposition. From the beginning, Zionism has never, ever sought coexistence, precisely because it is defined as the very antithesis of coexistence. Early Zionists were plain and explicit. Jabotinsky, Zionism is a colonization adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force. The same pronouncements we hear from Israelis today. As Ilan Pape writes, the expulsions of the Palestinians has been part of the Zionist DNA of the modern Jewish state. As far back as 1928, Palestinian leadership were engaged with questions of nationalism, unity, independence, and negotiating with the British, rejecting any political solutions that would hand any part of their country to a settler community. Despite being the majority of the population at about 89% in 1928, the Palestinian leadership voted to allow Jewish settlers equal representation in the future bodies of the state, despite them being the tiny minority, and it was rejected by the Zionists. Zionists have never come to Palestine intending to live as equals. I can already hear the response, but there are different ways of being a Zionist. To this I reply with the words of Leila Khaled. Zionist deeds are more eloquent than Zionist words. The proof of Zionism is the shredded babies buried in rice bags, the tortured Palestinians in Israel's dungeons, the babies in ICU, It is in the TikTok videos of young people dancing to genocide, dressing up in the lingerie of killed women and cheering on rape and slaughter. It is not my job as a Palestinian to predicate my freedom on the rehabilitation of an intrinsically violent and racist ideology. It is not my job to dilute our liberation project and manage my words because Zionists have deliberately branded their ideology as Jewish identity. It is not my job as a Palestinian to reconcile the consequences of Zionist strategic refusal to decouple Jewishness and the Abrahamic religion of Judaism from a racist, wholly anti-humanity political ideology. As Stephen Salacious says, there is no more liberal Zionist, low-key Zionist, cultural Zionist, soft, progressive, apathetic, ambivalent Zionist, non-Zionist or post-Zionist. Now only two categories matter, Zionist and anti-Zionist. These are existential questions to reflect on in how we talk about decolonization, about our insistence on first principles. And I am aware that to speak of one state, we face an entity that is this minute seeking to manifest tala nullius, to render the land empty of the native, of the subhuman, to carry out the general's plan of ethnic cleansing in North Gaza and then beyond, to deliver a land without the Palestinian people for a people who stole their land, to realise the dream articulated at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference when the World Zionist Organization presented a map in which the proposed Jewish state, at the time the population was a mere 2 to 3%, included not just all of Palestine, but the East Bank of Jordan, southern Lebanon, the Golan Heights, parts of the Sinai. And on 22nd September 2023, when Netanyahu smugly addressed the UN and held a map of Israel that covered the entire land. We Palestinians and Arabs have never been naive about the genocidal goals of the Zionist entity. We have been doomed to dialogue and conversation and peace talks with those who speak from two sides of their mouths. We are clear in our vision: land back, the return of refugees, equality, freedom and dignity for all who are equally committed to our shared humanity in Palestine from the river to the sea. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Caitlin.
Thanks so much, Randa and Nikolai, for that. I'll try to keep my my part of this fairly brief. I think I just wanted to talk about, I guess, what the implications of arguing for a one-state solution are for the movement here in Australia, because I think the so-called two-state solution has been used as a fig leaf by Western governments, including the Albanese government, for decades now, as an excuse for their ongoing support for the murderous regime, apartheid regime of Israel, and also to placate our movement here in Australia. And I think we need to have an answer to that. And I think, I've just anecdotally, a friend that works for MSF has said that even in the offices of the UN, around the offices, people actually joke about the two-state solution. People know that it's not a realistic solution. Quite apart from the fact that Netanyahu and successive Israeli governments have said they're not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in letting Palestine even exist as in the tiny enclaves that they have allowed to exist until now. But I think also for those of us here in Australia and other parts of the West, it's not simply that we, no moral person can stand for there to exist an ethno-supremacist apartheid state anywhere in the world. It's also that the ongoing existence of Israel, of apartheid Israel, poses a danger not only to the Palestinians who have suffered immeasurably since Israel's existence, but we're seeing very clearly now that it poses an ongoing danger to Lebanon, to Iran, to the entire region, and I would actually argue the world. And I think we need to be very clear about why the West and the Australian government continue to support apartheid Israel. It absolutely represents the interests of Western imperialism in the Middle East, and that is that is what it has existed for since day dot. It has never been about protecting the Jewish people, as the the Biden administration and sometimes Albanese would like to claim. You can look at the way that that Jewish pro-Palestinian Jewish protesters have been treated at protests in the US and on a smaller scale here in Australia. There's a quote that I think is very interesting that was said around the time just before the Balfour Declaration, before the lands of Palestine were sort of handed over to the Zionists, essentially, which is from Lord Curzon, who was a British politician. He said that in World War I, the Allies floated to victory on a sea of oil. And where did that oil come from? It came from the Middle East. And I think that shows how important the Middle East is to Western imperialism and continues to be. Now, obviously, since the 1967 war in particular, Israel has proved itself and its usefulness to Western imperialism over and over again in keeping in check the regimes and the populations of the entire Middle East, and that is the role of the watchdog, the attack dog of the West that it continues to play. Now, what does that mean for us here in Australia? About as far away as you could possibly get from Palestine. I think Australia is very clearly a key player in the Western imperialist alliance, and it's in all of our interests here to stop it from actually playing that role. We've had there's been conferences with the US military over the last year to actually expand the ongoing to expand the presence of the US military in Northern Australia. Australia is still trying to court the US to support it in its sort of saber rattling and warmongering against China. And in order to do that, it needs to continue to support Israel, the Israeli regime, regardless of how many lives it shatters, how many bombs it drops. It continues to support it to the hilt because of that role that it plays in imperialism as well. And I think although Albanese and Penny Wong have tried to make it seem as though they care about the lives of Palestinians, of civilians, of the dead children, they cry crocodile tears when someone like Zomi Frankham, the Australian aid worker, is killed. Who have they been killed by? What have they been killed by? There's a very, very high chance that actually the F-35 bombers that killed Zomi Frankham and tens of thousands of Palestinian people had parts in them that were made here in Australia, in Bankstown, in fact, at Quickstep factory. So it's not just a matter of the Albanese government isn't doing enough. Actually, they are actively contributing to the genocide that is happening in Gaza and that is now spreading to other parts of the Middle East. Just last month, Albanese posed in a photo next to a drone that was manufactured here in Australia. He's very interested in expanding the production of military goods in Australia, and that's something that we all need to fight. The fact that we have the Pine Gap military base right in the middle of Australia in the Northern Territory that is actually providing intelligence to the IDF on a daily basis. It's it's actually horrific to think about. But I think just to sort of to wrap up, I just wanted to refer to a poll that someone sent me that was recently conducted about that sort of broadly shows Australians' attitudes to the war on Palestine. So only 19% think that Israel's continued military actions in Gaza are justified. I think that's a very good number, and we can take heart from that. We can take heart from the fact that so many ordinary people recognise the horror of what is being inflicted on Gaza. But on the other hand, 56% of people are satisfied with the Australian government's response. And I think we need to take that number and realise that we need to build this movement outwards. We need to be, I think a lot of us are probably surrounded by a lot of people who, who see the horror and agree with us, but we need to be going further out into our communities, into our workplaces, building a movement outwards, an activist movement that that puts sanctions on Israel, that stops, Israeli parts being made, parts for weapons being made here in Australia. We need to be passing motions in our workplaces, on our campuses, and the rest of it we need to be going out into our communities, handing out leaflets in train stations, whatever it is. I think we need to build that movement. And I think, apart from the beautiful words that Randa said about the kind of glimpses that you can see of the possibility of what kind of state could exist in Palestine if we get rid of this idea of a two-state solution. I think we can also see glimpses of that in the pro-Palestine movement that we've been building here in Australia and that has built around the world, where you have Muslims, Jews, atheists, people of all walks of life marching and fighting together. That is the kind of secular democratic state of freedom that we need to fight for in Palestine, and we can't stop fighting until we get that outcome. So, yeah.